When you think of the Wild West, you picture gunfighters, outlaws, and dusty towns on the edge of civilization. But behind the legends of lawlessness stood men who dared to bring order to chaos. Men like Pat Garrett, known as the lawman who ended Billy the Kid's bloody ride. Garrett's story is more than just one famous gunfight. It's the tale of a man walking the razor's edge between justice and survival in a world where the law was only as strong as the man who carried the badge. Was he a hero, a killer, or something in between? Let's dig deep into the life and legacy of the last great lawman of the American frontier. If you love stories of gunslingers, legends, and the gritty truth about the Old West, hit that subscribe button and join us for more Wild West history. Patrick Floyd. Jarvis Garrett was a notable figure of the American frontier, remembered for his diverse roles as a lawman, bartender, and customs officer. He gained particular recognition during his tenure as sheriff in Lincoln County, New Mexico, and later in Doña Ana County. Garrett's career placed him at the center of significant events in the late 19th century, a time when the region was transitioning from lawlessness to structured governance. Much of Garrett's enduring fame comes from his association with the legendary outlaw Billy the Kid. Their encounter became one of the most discussed episodes of the Old West, shaping Garrett's reputation for generations. Over the years, this relationship has been retold in countless books and films, turning Garrett into a symbol of the complicated balance between law enforcement and frontier survival. Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett was born on June 5, 1850, in Chambers County, Alabama. He was the second of 5 children in the family of John Lumpkin Garrett and Elizabeth Ann Jarvis. His siblings were named Margaret, Elizabeth, John, and Alfred. Garrett's family traced its roots back to England. His ancestors had settled in America after migrating from several English counties, including Hertfordshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Lincolnshire, and Buckinghamshire. When Garrett was just 3 years old, his father invested in a large property, the John Grier Plantation, located in Claiborne Parish, Louisiana. This move seemed promising at first, but the outbreak of the Civil War brought financial ruin to many Southern families, including the Garretts. Tragedy struck the family when Elizabeth, Garrett's mother, passed away at the age of 37 on March the 25th, 1867. At that time, Pat was 16 years old. Less than a year later, on February 5th, 1868, their father also died at the age of 45. The Garrett children were left with a heavily indebted plantation, burdened by more than $30,000 of debt, a massive sum for the period. Relatives stepped in to care for the orphan children. By early 1869, Garrett, then 18, made the pivotal decision to leave Louisiana. On January 25th of that year, he set out for the West, beginning the journey that would shape the rest of his life. Buffalo hunter. For the next 7 years, details about Garrett's life remain somewhat unclear. Historical records do not fully document where he lived or what he did during this time. By 1876, however, Garrett had surfaced in Texas, working as a buffalo hunter. This was during the final years of the great buffalo hunting era, which had drawn many frontiersmen to the plains. It was during this period that Garrett became involved in a fatal altercation with another hunter named Joe Briscoe. Accounts suggest that Garrett reported the incident and turned himself in at Fort Griffin, Texas. The local authorities reviewed the case but chose not to bring formal charges, likely viewing the matter as self-defense, a common interpretation on the frontier. As the buffalo herds disappeared and the industry collapsed, Garrett sought new opportunities. He eventually left Texas and made his way to the New Mexico Territory. Upon reaching Fort Sumner, New Mexico, Garrett first found employment tending bar. Later, he took a job as a cowboy on the ranch of Pedro Menard, Pete Maxwell, a prominent rancher in the area. Family life. Pat Garrett's first marriage was to Juanita Martinez. She was born in May 1860 in Taos, New Mexico, to Antonio Domingo Martinez and Maria Manuela Trujillo. At some point, the family relocated to Cimarron. Tragedy struck when Juanita's mother passed away during childbirth, and the newborn did not survive. Following this loss, Juanita moved to Fort Sumner, living with her uncle, Celedon Trujillo, who worked for the well-known rancher Lucian Maxwell. Garrett and Juanita were married in the fall of 1879 in Fort Sumner. The wedding was attended by several of Garrett's acquaintances, including Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boger, and Billy the Kid. Sadly, Juanita became seriously ill either during the ceremony or shortly afterward. She died just 15 days later, at the age of 19, likely due to stress or medical complications common in that era. She was laid to rest in the Fort Sumner Cemetery. Later speculation suggested that Juanita was the older sister of Garrett's second wife, Apollinaria or Apollonia Gutierrez. However, historian Leon C. Metz clarified this was incorrect. Apollinaria had only one sister, Celsa Gutierrez. On January 14, 1880, Garrett married Apollinaria Gutierrez. Their marriage was long-lasting, and between 1881 and 1905, they had 8 children: Ada, Dudley, Elizabeth, Annie, Patrick, Pauline, Oscar, and Jarvis. Interestingly, Celsa Gutierrez, Apollinaria's sister and a resident of Fort Sumner, was rumored to have had a romantic connection with Billy the Kid around the time of his death, a detail that adds another layer to the intertwined lives of these historical figures. The chase for Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid, whose real name was Henry McCarty and who later adopted the alias William Henry Bonney Jr., became a wanted man after the violent conflicts of the Lincoln County War. On November 2, 1880, Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County. He won decisively, defeating the sitting sheriff, George Kimball, by a vote of 320 to 179. Garrett's official term was scheduled to start on January 1, 1881. But before that, Sheriff Kimball appointed him as a deputy to serve out the remainder of his term. In addition to this role, Garrett received a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal. This federal authority was significant because it allowed him to track fugitives, including Billy the Kid, across territorial lines, a common necessity in the loosely controlled frontier. On November 30th, 1880, Garrett and a small posse rode to the Dedrick Ranch at Bosque Grande, expecting to find Billy the Kid. The search did not go as planned. Instead of capturing the kid, they arrested John Joshua Webb, who was facing a murder charge, along with George Davis, accused of horse theft. Garrett soon delivered Webb and Davis to the sheriff of San Miguel County, fulfilling his legal duty. Afterward, he continued his efforts to locate the kid, traveling to the settlement of Puerto de Luna. While in Puerto de Luna, Garrett encountered local tensions. A man named Mariano Leyva reportedly challenged him during an altercation. The situation escalated, and Leyva sustained a shoulder injury, an example of how law enforcement in the Old West often blended with personal disputes and volatile social dynamics. On December 19, 1880, Billy the Kid arrived in Fort Sumner with several companions, including Charlie Boger, Tom Pickett, Billy Wilson, Dave Rudabaugh, and Tom O'Folliard. Unbeknownst to them, Deputy Pat Garrett and his posse were waiting nearby. During the encounter, Garrett's men mistook Tom O'Folliard for Billy the Kid. In the confusion, O'Folliard was fatally wounded. The rest of the group managed to flee without injury. Just 3 days later, Garrett and his posse tracked the outlaws to a remote spot known as Stinking Springs. This time, there was no escape. Charlie Boger lost his life during the confrontation, while the remaining members, including Billy, were taken into custody. On April 15, 1881, Judge Warren Bristol sentenced Billy the Kid to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for May, but Billy made a daring escape 13 days later, resulting in the deaths of 2 deputies, an event that shocked the territory and elevated his notoriety even further. The pursuit ended on July 14, 1881. Garrett returned to Fort Sumner, hoping to gather information from acquaintances of Billy. He learned that the kid was staying at the home of Pedro Manar, Pete Maxwell, a mutual friend. Late that night, Garrett entered Maxwell's bedroom and waited quietly in the dark. At some point after midnight, Billy entered the room, unaware that Garrett was inside. Unable to recognize the figure in the shadows, Billy spoke in Spanish, repeatedly asking, "¿Quién es?" meaning, "Who is it?" Moments later, Garrett fired twice. The first shot struck Billy above the heart, while the second missed. Accounts differ on whether he died instantly or lingered for a short time, leaving a lingering mystery about the final moments of one of the Old West's most infamous figures. Account of Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett collaborated with Ash Upson to publish the authentic life of Billy the Kid. For many years, this work was regarded as the definitive account of Billy's life and death. After Billy the Kid's death, however, numerous writers began publishing stories and books that romanticized the outlaw as a folk hero. These narratives often cast Garrett in a negative light, portraying him as a cold enforcer rather than a lawman performing his duty. Despite containing numerous factual inaccuracies, the authentic life remained the primary reference for most publications about Billy the Kid until well into the 1960s. Ironically, the book was not a commercial success when first released, but over time, original copies became extremely valuable. By 1969, historian Ramon F. Adams described the original 1882 edition as exceedingly rare. Revised and reprinted editions appeared throughout the 20th century, notably in 1927, 1946, and 1964, often under slightly altered titles. These later versions helped keep Garrett's perspective alive, even as popular culture increasingly romanticized Billy the Kid. In 1882, Garrett chose not to run for re-election as sheriff of Lincoln County. Instead, he relocated to Texas and entered politics, campaigning for a seat in the state Senate, an effort that proved unsuccessful. He briefly served as a captain in the Texas Rangers, a position he held for less than a month before returning to Roswell, New Mexico, to resume civilian life. Middle years. While living in the Roswell area, Pat Garrett identified a large source of artesian water, a valuable resource in the arid Southwest. Seeing its potential, he entered into a partnership with two associates and on July 18, 1885, helped establish the Pecos Valley Irrigation and Investment Company. Garrett remained committed to irrigation projects for several years, believing they could transform the region. On January 15, 1887, he purchased a one-third stake in the Texas Irrigation Ditch Company. However, his involvement in that venture ended when the other partners decided to remove him from the business. Undeterred, Garrett partnered with William L. Lawman on August 15, 1887, creating the Lawman and Garrett Ditch Company. Despite these efforts, none of Garrett's irrigation ventures achieved lasting success, a reflection of the financial and logistical challenges that plagued water projects in the late 19th century Southwest. By 1892, Garrett relocated his growing family to Uvalde, Texas. There, he developed a close friendship with John Nance Garner, who would later serve as Vice President of the United States under Franklin D. Roosevelt. It seemed Garrett might settle permanently in Uvalde and live a quieter life. However, a major event back in New Mexico would soon pull him back into the headlines and change the course of his later years. On January 31, 1896, Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son, Henry, vanished near the edge of the White Sands region in southern New Mexico. Despite extensive searches, neither of them was ever seen again. The disappearance sparked a major investigation. Apache scouts, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and even significant political influence from the Republican Party were brought in to uncover the truth. Yet the case remained unsolved and became one of the most enduring mysteries of the Southwest. In April 1896, Pat Garrett was appointed sheriff of Doña Ana County. Over the next 2 years, he worked to gather evidence linking suspects to the Fountain case. By 1898, he felt confident enough to move forward. Garrett asked a judge in Las Cruces to issue warrants for Oliver M. Lee, William McNew, Bill Carr, and James Gilliland. Acting quickly, Garrett arrested McNew and Carr within hours of obtaining the warrants. The remaining suspects, Lee and Gilliland, proved harder to capture. On July 12, 1898, Garrett and his posse tracked them to a remote spot known as Wildy Well, near Oro Grande, New Mexico. Garrett planned a surprise arrest, hoping to find the men asleep. However, Lee and Jyleland anticipated trouble. Instead of sleeping inside, they positioned their bedrolls on the roof of the bunkhouse to watch for intruders. During the standoff, one of Garrett's deputies, named Kearney, climbed a ladder after hearing movement above. Gunfire broke out, leaving Kearney severely wounded. Garrett himself was grazed by a bullet in the exchange. Prioritizing the care of his injured deputy, Garrett called for a truce and withdrew to transport Kearney to safety. Sadly, the deputy did not survive the journey back to Las Cruces. Lee and Jyleland evaded capture for 8 more months before surrendering voluntarily to Sheriff George Curry. When brought to trial, both men were acquitted of the Fountain disappearances, and the charges related to the deputy's death were also dismissed. In 1899, Pat Garrett was involved in his last major confrontation with an outlaw. The fugitive was Norman Newman, wanted in Greer County, Oklahoma, for a murder charge. Newman had taken refuge at the San Augustin Ranch in New Mexico. Sheriff George Blaylock of Greer County traveled to New Mexico to seek Garrett's assistance. Garrett, Blaylock, and Garrett's deputy, Jose Espelin, rode to the ranch to arrest Newman. On October 7, 1899, during the attempted capture, Newman was killed in the exchange. A few years later, on December 16, 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt nominated Garrett for the position of Collector of Customs in El Paso, Texas. Garrett's reputation as a lawman earned him a place among Roosevelt's so-called White House gunfighters, alongside Bat Masterson and Ben Daniels. Despite some public criticism of the appointment, the U.S. Senate confirmed Garrett on January 2, 1902. His term, however, proved contentious from the start. On May 8, 1903, Garrett engaged in a public fistfight with one of his employees, George Gather. The following day, both men paid a $5 fine for disturbing the peace. Complaints about Garrett's management continued to flow to Washington, with critics accusing him of incompetence. Nevertheless, President Roosevelt initially stood by Garrett. As a sign of confidence, Roosevelt invited him to attend a Rough Riders reunion in San Antonio in April of 1905. The invitation carried extra weight because Garrett had never served in the Rough Riders, making the gesture a symbolic rebuke to his detractors. Garrett attended the event with a guest named Tom Powers, whom he introduced to Roosevelt as a respected Texas cattleman. The two posed for photographs with the president, including one taken at dinner. However, Garrett's opponents quickly obtained copies of the images and informed Roosevelt that Powers was not a rancher, but the owner of a notorious El Paso saloon called the Coney Island. This revelation embarrassed the president and became the final breaking point. On January 2, 1906, Garrett was replaced as Collector of Customs. Late years. After losing his position as Customs Collector, Pat Garrett returned with his family to New Mexico. By this time, he was facing severe financial hardship. His ranch was heavily mortgaged, and when Garrett could not meet his payments, the county moved to recover the debt. All of his personal belongings were auctioned off to satisfy outstanding judgments. The sale brought in a total of only $650, a sum that reflected the depth of his financial troubles. Around this time, President Theodore Roosevelt appointed Garrett's friend George Curry as the territorial governor of New Mexico. Garrett met with Curry, who assured him that once he officially assumed office, Garrett would be appointed as superintendent of the territorial prison in Santa Fe. However, Curry's inauguration was still several months away. With no immediate source of income, Garrett left his family in New Mexico and returned to El Paso in search of work. There, he secured a position with the real estate firm of H.M. Maple and Company. During his stay in El Paso, Garrett entered into a relationship with a woman known as Mrs. Brown, who was widely believed to be a prostitute. When Governor-elect Curry learned of Garrett's association with her, the offer of the prison superintendent position was rescinded. Pat Garrett's son, Dudley Poe Garrett, had signed a 5-year lease on the family's Bear Canyon Ranch with Jesse Wayne Brazel. The arrangement soon became contentious when Brazel began bringing in large herds of goats. For cattle ranchers like Garrett, goats were seen as highly destructive to grazing land, making the situation unacceptable. Garrett attempted to void the lease after discovering that Brazel's financial backing came from a neighbor, W. Bill Cox. His frustration grew when he learned that Archie Prentice Print Road, had partnered with Brazel in the goat operation. When Brazel refused to terminate the agreement, Garrett initiated legal proceedings. During this dispute, James B. Miller stepped in to mediate. Miller spoke with Brazel, who eventually agreed to cancel the lease on the condition that someone purchase his 1,200 goats. Carl Adamson, a man connected to Miller by marriage, agreed to buy the herd. The situation appeared resolved until Brazel announced that he had miscounted the goats. Instead of 1,200, he now claimed there were 1,800. Adamson refused to buy such a large number, but agreed to meet with Garrett and Brazel to negotiate a solution. Garrett and Adamson set out together in Adamson's wagon, leaving from Las Cruces, New Mexico. Along the route, Brazel approached on horseback. What happened next has remained one of the great controversies of the Old West. Garrett was fatally shot during the encounter, but the identity of the shooter has never been conclusively established. After the incident, Brazel and Adamson left Garrett's body by the roadside and returned to Las Cruces. There, Brazel surrendered to Deputy Sheriff Felipe Lucero. According to Lucero, more than 3 decades later, Brazel reportedly said, "Lock me up. I've just killed Pat Garrett." He then pointed to Adamson, saying that Adamson had witnessed the shooting and could confirm it was self-defense. Lucero detained Brazel, summoned a coroner's jury, and went to recover Garrett's body. Brazel's trial for Garrett's death began and ended on May 4, 1909, represented by attorney Albert Bacon Fall, who would later become U.S. Secretary of the Interior. Brazel stood trial for just 1 day. Adamson, the only eyewitness, never testified. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty, leaving many questions unanswered. The official coroner's report identified Jesse Wayne Brazel as the man who shot Pat Garrett. Brazel reportedly admitted responsibility, yet during his trial he was acquitted. Over the years, doubts about Brazel's guilt have persisted, and several alternative suspects have been suggested, including Carl Adamson, W.W. Bill Cox, Archie Prentice, Print Road, and James B. Miller. In a 1970 publication, historian Glenn Shirley argued that Miller was the likely killer. 4 years later, Leon C. Metz presented another theory in his biography of Garrett, citing the claim of W.T. Moyers, who believed Cox had ambushed Garrett. Metz also noted that members of the Garrett family long suspected Carl Adamson as the true shooter. In 2010, historian Mark Lee Gardner offered a different perspective, suggesting that Road was responsible for Garrett's death. These conflicting theories demonstrate how the killing of Pat Garrett remains one of the enduring mysteries of the American Southwest. Today, the site of Garrett's death is marked by a historical monument located just south of U.S. Route 70, between Las Cruces and San Agustin Pass. The marker sits about 1.2 miles from where the shooting occurred. In 1940, Garrett's son, Jarvis Garrett, placed a small monument at the site. It consists of a stone with a carved cross, believed to have been made by Garrett's mother, set in concrete with the inscription P. Garrett and the date of his death scratched into the surface. However, the preservation of this historic location has faced challenges. In 2020, a proposed development project by the city of Las Cruces threatened the site. In response, a group called Friends of Pat Garrett formed to advocate for its protection and preservation. Garrett's burial also reflected the challenges of the time. Standing 6 feet, 5 inches tall, his body was too large for any available coffin, so a custom-made casket had to be brought in from El Paso. His funeral took place on March 5, 1908, and he was interred beside his daughter Ida, who had passed away in 1896 at the age of 15. Today, the graves of Pat Garrett and his family can be found in the Masonic Cemetery in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Pat Garrett's story is a complex one, part Lawman, part legend, and part cautionary tale. He was celebrated as the man who ended Billy the Kid's bloody trail, yet his own life unraveled in betrayal, financial troubles, and an unsolved murder that still haunts Old West history. Was Garrett truly the last great lawman of the wild frontier, or simply another figure swallowed by its chaos? That's for history to decide. If you enjoyed this journey into the life of Pat Garrett and want more incredible stories from the American Old West, hit that subscribe button and join us for more untamed legends, shocking truths, and forgotten tales of the frontier.